protected areas or habitats.
Hi, thank you for watching this presentation. My name's Eleanor Turner and I'm the Biosphere Officer working with South Kerry Development Partnership on the UNESCO Kerry Biosphere Reserve. So to start off with, what are Biosphere Reserves? Well, Biosphere Reserves are UNESCO designated areas that work on nature conservation. So there's always an element of protected areas or habitats within a Biosphere Reserve. But it's not just about the nature. It's also about how we use the areas as people, how we make our livelihoods, the businesses that exist in the area, and how we might use that area for recreation. So we like to say a Biosphere Reserve is a place where nature and culture connect. I'm often asked what the word UNESCO stands for. UNESCO is the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. So if you ever get asked that in a quiz again, now you'll know. Worldwide, there are over 700 UNESCO Biosphere Reserves and more get added, so that number continues to rise. But in Ireland, there are only 2 UNESCO Biosphere Reserves. We have the Dublin Bay Biosphere Reserve on the east coast and the Kerry Biosphere Reserve over on the west. Whereabouts in Kerry do you find the Biosphere Reserve? Well, loosely put, it's around the centre here. It includes the Killarney National Park, areas of the McGillicuddy Reeks, over into the Paps Mountain Range on the eastern side of the county, and some of the towns and villages surrounding that area. Biosphere reserves are made up of 3 different areas. You have a core area that you can see at the center of this little graph here, the green section. Core areas are strictly protected zones that contribute to the conservation of landscape, ecosystems, species, and genetic variation. Around the core area, you have the buffer zone. That's the darker blue section in this graph. The buffer zone surrounds or adjoins the core area and is used for activities that are compatible with sound ecological practices that can reinforce scientific research, monitoring, training, and education. And then the third area, around the outside of the other 2, we have the transition zone. The transition area is where communities foster socio-culturally and ecologically sustainable economic and human activities. So it can be said that biosphere reserves are learning places for sustainable development. There's a worldwide network of biosphere reserves, and that covers approximately 6.8 million kilometers squared. And globally, there are over 257 million people living in biosphere reserves. So they're areas that are very important for ecological conservation and sustainable development. Now here's a close-up map of the Kerry UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. And you can see the different zones colored in here. So the red section in the middle is the core zone, and that coincides with the area of Killarney National Park. The oranger area on either side is the buffer zone, and that includes areas of the McGillicuddy Reeks and over across to the Paps Mountain Range over in the eastern side. The green area around the outside then is the transition zone, and that's where we start to see people working for sustainable development. A quick challenge for you. Before we go on any further, have a little think. How many different animals and plants can you think of that live in the Kerry Biosphere Reserve? Take a few minutes and draw or write down as many as you can. You might ask your teacher to pause the video here so that you can have a little extra time. And then tell us afterwards what you thought you could find in the Kerry Biosphere Reserve. So a good way to start thinking about what animals you might find in a certain area is to look at the habitats that you can find. So when we talk about a habitat is a place where an organism makes its home. A habitat meets all the environmental conditions an organism needs to survive. So for an animal, that means everything it needs to find and gather food and successfully reproduce. So some of the habitats that we can find in the Kerry UNESCO Biosphere Reserve are freshwater habitats, bogs, upland habitats of wet and dry heath, and woodlands. Everyone knows Killarney's famous for its woodlands, where it has old sessile oak woods and alluvial forest. So when we talk about the freshwater habitats, some of the animals that we'd expect to find there in a healthy freshwater habitat are fish like salmon, amphibians like frogs, lots of different insects like dragonflies, spiders, lots of beetles, lots of insects live in the water as well. And you'll also see some larger animals that use the area to hunt for food. Like in Killarney National Park, for example, we have some sea eagles. You'll also see bird species like heron that are associated with wet areas or water-filled areas like the edges of lakes or rivers where they use them to hunt for food. When we talk about freshwater habitats, we're not just talking about the lakes, even though Killarney is most famous for its lakes, we're also talking about the mountain streams and the rivers as well. Some of our areas are covered by bogs, and bogs are really important ecologically speaking. There's lots of animals that depend on them for their habitats. So we have predators like the fox, or bird species like the kestrel that will be hunting smaller animals. We have animals like the Irish hare, and then again, because bogs are wet areas, you'll have amphibians, and you'll also find lots of different insect species, and bird species like the curlew. So now we move to the uplands, and we have upland heath areas. And in the picture on the top left, you can see a very close-up photo of what a healthy heath area would look like. So there's lots of moss underneath, and there's lots of different plants that live there. Some of those plants are even carnivorous, and that means that they eat insects rather than just making their energy from food or from sunshine like other plants. When we get to the uplands in Kerry, we see a lot of farming activity, so you're bound to bump into a few sheep and sometimes a few cows. When you see both sheep and cows grazing the land, it's called a dual grazing system. And this is important for some of our upland areas because you see the long grass in the middle of the photo in the background. That's called fanon, and it can get quite long and take over some areas. So big animals like the cattle are able to graze it down and help to keep the habitat healthier and have a greater diversity of plant species. One thing that we have to consider in the uplands as well is recreation. Lots of people like to go walking up mountains, hill walking or mountain climbing. And so we have to think about access and whether the places that we're accessing are looked after and protected. So part of what we do is to create paths in the uplands, and that helps to keep people on the path rather than walking over healthy habitats and damaging some of the plants. Now, Killarney is famous for its woodlands. I'm sure some of you have been to visit Killarney National Park and seen the amazing trees there. So a woodland is an area where the trees are creating a habitat for other things to live. So you have tons of different bird species, tons of different insects. You even have bats. And in Killarney, we have Ireland's only indigenous wild herd of red deer. You'll also find smaller mammals like hedgehogs and squirrels. And down in the right-hand corner, you can see a picture with some of the different types of leaves that you find from all the different species of trees too. So there's lots of conservation work involved in the Kerry Biosphere Reserve, and let's talk a little bit about that now. So one of the issues that we have in the Kerry Biosphere Reserve is with invasive species. So the difference between native and invasive species is this. Native species occur naturally in the area, so they've always been there. And a good example of this is the Irish hare. An invasive species is an animal that has been introduced by human activity. So either people brought it in as a pet and it got free, or if it's a plant, maybe it came in and then it spread its seeds and it's able to grow. But the problem with some of the invasive species is that they can displace native species. So when you think about how our habitats are built up of all different species that live together, when you add an invasive species, sometimes the balance can get knocked off a little bit. One example of this that we have is the rhododendron in Killarney National Park and in the upland areas surrounding the national park. Rhododendron can grow really thickly and really quickly take over areas. And this reduces the light for other plants to grow. So within a woodland, if the area gets taken over by rhododendron, there won't be any new native trees able to grow. And so the balance of the woodland will be knocked off. And you'll end up having an unhealthy woodland. And that's one of the problems that we have with invasive species. Another thing that we see is damaged habitat or unhealthy habitat. So on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see a healthy peatland. Now this is the same close-up photo we saw before, the upland heath. And you can see there's lots of different plants that are there. There's a huge amount of cover over the ground and you can't see any of the soil. So this is what we'd call a healthy peatland. And over on the left, we see a kind of eroded peatland. So there's not a lot of vegetation covering the soil. If we get heavy rain, it could all get washed off and the rain is going to flow very quickly over that land. So one of the great things about peatland is that it helps in water conservation. So there's lots of mosses along that form the basis of the habitat, and they soak up lots and lots of water. So when it rains, the healthy peatland absorbs all the water and stops it flowing too quickly down into our streams and rivers and lakes. and this can help to prevent flooding further down the rivers. A healthy peatland is also really important for carbon sequestration, so it brings carbon in from the atmosphere, and that helps when we're talking about climate change. Another one of the conservation issues that we see in the Kerry UNESCO Biosphere Reserve is with paths and recreation. So obviously it's a beautiful landscape, and it's the best way to spend a weekend is to go and explore the mountains. But we have to be careful where we're walking. So on the left you can see kind of a broken path. So it's been eroded down, it's all got wet, it's not very easy to walk over, and so people have started to dodge that area and go around the outside. And this leads to the habitat on either side of the path getting damaged. So if we fix the path and then everyone is happy to walk in the middle of the path, then the habitats on the outside stay protected. And that's another way that we're conserving the habitats within the Kerry UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. So throughout the seasons, in any habitat you can see there's lots of changes. And we're going to talk a little bit about the different changes you see from spring, summer, autumn, and winter in the Kerry Biosphere Reserve now. So in spring, as the weather warms up, everything starts to come alive again. The trees start to grow their new leaves, and many animals have their young. So you'll see lambs on the mountains, birds building nests and laying eggs. It's a good time to plant some vegetables in your garden if you want to eat some nice vegetables later in the year. And towards the end of spring, we'll start to see some of the birds that migrated away from Ireland for winter return to spend summer here with us. In the summertime, it's the time of most growth, so there's lots of grass out on the land, and the farmers in the reeks will have to bring their sheep in to shear them. There's lots of flowers in bloom, and these are very important for our pollinators. And we also see an increase in the number of visitors to the Kerry Biosphere Reserve looking to explore the landscape there. That usually happens in the summertime. In the autumn, we all know the leaves start to fall off the deciduous trees, and everyone is preparing for winter. Lots of animals are stocking up on food, so hedgehogs and squirrels will stock up food piles or eat as much as they can before they hibernate. And the deer rut happens in Killarney National Park, so if you're in the park area, you have to be careful to stay away from deer because they can be quite excitable this time of year. And some of our migratory bird species that came to join us for the summer are preparing to leave to go south for the winter to find warmer areas where there'll be more food available for the winter. In the winter, the animals like hedgehogs and squirrels will be hibernating to avoid the cold season. Because it's cold and there's not a lot of growth, the farmers will have to take feed out to their animals, so that's a big job for the farmers in the Reeks district in the winter. And some of the birds come to stay in Ireland over winter to escape more harsh climates further north. So we get a lot of species that actually come here to spend the winter because the weather's better here than it is where they originally come from. So thank you for listening to this presentation about the Kerry UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. Thank you very much. If you need to contact me, you can email me at kerrybiosphere@skdp.net. Bye now.